The blood-curdling scream pierced the evening air of Willow Creek, stopping Marshal Mason Hayes dead in his tracks as he approached the town's only cafe. Through the dusty windows, he witnessed a scene that made his blood boil, a burly man's hand connecting with a woman's face, sending her sprawling to the floor as a coffee cup clattered beside her. Mason burst through the swinging doors, hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. "Not while I'm here," he growled, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had kept peace in this territory for the past 3 years. The year was 1878, and Willow Creek, Colorado was like any other frontier town, a mixture of promise and peril, where fortunes could be made and lives could be lost with equal ease. The smell of sawdust and whiskey hung in the air, mingling with the aroma of fresh coffee that now stained the wooden floorboards of May's cafe. Lillian Zimmerman dabbed at her bleeding lip, her emerald eyes wide with a combination of fear and relief as she stared up at the tall figure who had just entered. She had only been working at May's for 2 weeks, having arrived on the stagecoach from Boston with nothing but a small trunk and dreams of a new beginning after her parents' passing. "She spilled coffee all over my new vest," the man bellowed, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. Everyone knew Frank Thornton as the owner of the largest cattle ranch in the county. His wealth and influence had made him untouchable, or so he believed. "I don't care if she dumped the whole pot on your head, Thornton," Mason said, stepping between them. "You put your hands on a woman in my town again, and you'll be spending more than a night in my jail." Thornton spat on the floor. "You forget who pays your salary, Marshal." "The people of Willow Creek pay my salary," Mason replied evenly, though his eyes remained hard as steel. "And right now, they're witnessing what kind of man you really are." The tension in the room was palpable as patrons watched the standoff. Mason hadn't drawn his weapon, but his stance made it clear he was prepared to. At 48, Frank Thornton was 2 decades older than the Marshal, but his girth and reputation had always been enough to intimidate most folks. "This ain't over," Thornton muttered, throwing coins on the table before storming out, purposely bumping Mason's shoulder as he passed. When the doors swung shut behind him, Mason turned his attention to the young woman still on the floor. Kneeling beside her, he offered a clean handkerchief from his pocket. "Are you all right, miss?" Lillian nodded shakily, accepting the handkerchief and pressing it to her swelling cheek. "I'll be fine, thank you, Marshal." Her voice carried the refined accent of the East, out of place in this rugged mountain town. "Mason Hayes," he introduced himself, helping her to her feet. "And you are?" "Lillian Zimmerman. I recently arrived from Boston." She attempted a smile, wincing at the pain. "It seems I'm still learning the customs of the West." "There's no custom that excuses what just happened," Mason assured her, his voice softening. "Let me help you clean this up." As Mason assisted Lillian and the cafe owner, Mae Johnson, in righting the overturned table and collecting the shattered remains of cups and plates, he couldn't help but notice the grace with which Lillian carried herself despite the ordeal. Her chestnut hair was coming loose from its pins, framing a face that, even with the beginning of a bruise, held a quiet determination. "You're new to town," Mason observed, more statement than question. "Yes," Lillian replied, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I came west after my parents passed. There wasn't much left for me in Boston, and I'd always dreamed of seeing the frontier." "And is it everything you imagined?" Mason asked, unable to keep a hint of wry humor from his voice. Lillian's laugh was unexpected and bright, despite her injury. "Well, I didn't precisely imagine being struck by an angry cattle baron on my second week of employment, but the mountains are as beautiful as I'd hoped." Mason found himself smiling genuinely for the first time in months. There was something refreshing about her spirit, unbroken despite the harsh welcome Willow Creek had offered. "Marshal Hayes is the reason this town is still standing," May interjected, her weathered face creasing with affection for the lawman. 3 years ago, This place was overrun with outlaws before he arrived. May exaggerates, Mason said, tipping his hat modestly. The good people of this town just needed someone to stand with them. Well, I'm grateful you stood with me tonight, Lillian said softly, her eyes meeting his. Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, a connection neither could define. The moment was broken by the arrival of Doc Wilson, summoned by one of the cafe patrons. The elderly physician clucked his tongue disapprovingly as he examined Lillian's face. "You'll have quite the bruise, young lady, but nothing's broken. Apply cold compresses tonight, and I'll check on you tomorrow." "Thank you, doctor," Lillian replied, her poise impressive given the circumstances. "I'll be fine to work tomorrow, May." "Nonsense," the older woman replied firmly. "You'll take a day to rest. Sarah can cover your shift." As the excitement died down and customers returned to their meals, Mason knew he should continue his evening rounds. Yet he found himself reluctant to leave. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, adjusting his hat, "would you allow me to escort you home? I'd like to ensure you arrive safely." Lillian hesitated only briefly before nodding. "That would be most kind, Marshal Hayes." The night air had cooled considerably as they stepped out onto the boardwalk. Stars punctuated the dark sky, more brilliant than any Lillian had seen in Boston. She wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders, both for warmth and comfort. "Where are you staying?" Mason asked, falling into step beside her. "Mrs. Peterson's boarding house," Lillian replied. "It's not much, but it's clean, and she doesn't ask too many questions." Mason nodded approvingly. "Mabel Peterson's a good woman. Her husband was a deputy before he passed. She keeps a shotgun under the counter and knows how to use it." "That's reassuring, I suppose," Lillian said with a small smile. They walked in companionable silence for a few moments, the only sounds their footsteps on the wooden boardwalk and the distant piano from the saloon down the street. "Why did you really come west, Miss Zimmerman?" Mason finally asked. "If you don't mind my asking." "Most Eastern ladies aren't eager to trade comforts for frontier life." Lillian considered the question. "After my parents died of influenza last winter, I discovered my father had made some poor investments. The house I grew up in, the life I knew, it was all gone. I could have found work as a governess or companion, but—" She trailed off, searching for words. "But you wanted more," Mason finished for her. "Yes," she admitted, looking up at him with surprise. "I wanted to build something that was truly mine. To see what I'm capable of beyond the drawing rooms of Boston." Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The West is good for that. Hard, but good." They reached the boarding house, a 2-story white clapboard structure with a small porch. Light glowed warmly from the downstairs windows. "Thank you for walking me home, Marshal," Lillian said, turning to face him at the bottom of the steps. "Mason," he corrected gently. "When I'm not wearing the badge, I'm just Mason." "Then thank you, Mason," she amended, a slight blush coloring her uninjured cheek. "I'll check on you tomorrow," he promised. "And don't worry about Thornton. His type makes noise but seldom follows through when they know they're being watched." Lillian nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "Good night." Then, as Mason watched her disappear into the boarding house, he couldn't shake the feeling that Thornton's threat, "This ain't over," might prove more prophetic than he'd let on. The cattle baron wasn't accustomed to being challenged publicly, especially not over a cafe worker he deemed beneath his notice. With a final glance at the now closed door, Mason continued his rounds, his thoughts straying repeatedly to chestnut hair and emerald eyes that somehow managed to look both vulnerable and indomitable at once. Morning brought clear skies and the bustle of a town coming to life. Despite May's insistence that she take the day off, Lillian found herself restless in her small rented room. The mirror confirmed what she already knew. A purplish bruise bloomed across her left cheekbone, stark against her pale skin. A knock at her door startled her. Opening it, she found Mrs. Peterson, a sturdy woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and kind eyes. "Marshal Hayes is downstairs asking after you," she informed Lillian with barely concealed curiosity. "Said he wanted to see how you're faring this morning." "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. Please tell him I'll be down shortly." Lillian quickly pinned her hair and changed into a simple blue dress, one of the few she'd brought from Boston. She dabbed a bit of powder on her bruise, though it did little to conceal it. Mason was waiting in the small sitting room, hat in hands. He stood when she entered, and Lillian was struck again by his height and the quiet authority he carried without effort. In the daylight, she better noted the details she'd missed last night, the way the sun had weathered his skin. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the streak of silver at his temples that belied his relatively young age. "Miss Zimmerman," he greeted her, his expression concerned as he took in her bruised face. "How are you feeling today?" "Better than I look, I assure you," she replied with a self-deprecating smile. "And please, call me Lillian." "Lillian, then." Her name sounded different when he said it, warmer somehow. "I've spoken with the town council this morning about Thornton's behavior. They're not pleased." "I don't wish to cause trouble." "You didn't," Mason interrupted firmly. "Thornton did. And it's not the first time. He's gotten away with too much because of his money and influence. But striking a woman publicly crosses a line even his friends on the council can't ignore." Lillian sank onto a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the thought of being at the center of town politics after less than a month in Willow Creek. Noticing her distress, Mason sat across from her. "I didn't mean to worry you. I just wanted you to know that what happened isn't being dismissed." "Thank you," she said softly. "In Boston, a man of Mr. Thornton's standing would likely face no consequences at all for such an act." "This isn't Boston," Mason replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "Out here, a man's word and actions define him more than his bank account. At least, that's what we strive for." Their conversation was interrupted when the front door burst open, and a young boy of about 12 rushed in, eyes wide with urgency. "Marshal Hayes," he called, breathless from running. "There's trouble at May's. Mr. Thornton came back with some of his men." Mason was on his feet instantly, settling his hat on his head. "Stay here," he instructed Lillian firmly. "But, please," he added, his eyes conveying concern beyond professional duty. "I need to know you're safe." Something in his gaze made her nod in agreement. "Be careful, Mason." With a quick tip of his hat, he was gone, striding purposefully after the boy. Lillian lasted exactly 7 minutes before her conscience got the better of her. May had shown her nothing but kindness since she'd arrived in town, offering her work when others might have dismissed an Eastern lady as too delicate for frontier life. If May was in trouble because of what had happened to Lillian, she couldn't simply hide away. Grabbing her shawl, Lillian slipped out of the boarding house, ignoring Mrs. Peterson's concerned calls. The main street was unnaturally quiet as she hurried toward the cafe, townspeople having cleared the area at the first sign of trouble. As she approached, she saw a cluster of horses tied outside, fine quarter horses bearing the Thornton Ranch brand. Through the windows, she could make out several figures, including Mason's tall form facing off against Thornton and 3 of his ranch hands. Drawing a deep breath, Lillian pushed open the door and stepped inside. All conversation ceased as heads turned toward her. May stood behind the counter, a shotgun in her weathered hands. Mason's expression shifted from determination to dismay at Lillian's appearance. "Well, well," Thornton drawled, his bloodshot eyes focusing on Lillian. "Here's the clumsy little troublemaker herself." "Mr. Thornton," Lillian acknowledged evenly, summoning every ounce of the composure her Boston upbringing had instilled. "I believe I owe you an apology for the accident yesterday. If you'll allow me to pay for the cleaning of your vest." Lillian, don't, Mason warned, but she continued, approaching slowly. I'm still learning my way here, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. In Boston, differences between people are often resolved through civil conversation rather than physical means. Thornton's face flushed with anger, but something in Lillian's dignified demeanor made him hesitate. The cafe had filled with onlookers now, townspeople watching from windows and doorways. You think you're better than us with your fancy Eastern talk, Thornton accused. But his blustering lacked its usual force as murmurs rose from the gathering crowd. Mayor Wilson pushed his way through, his normally jovial face stern. Frank, that's enough. The town council has convened this morning, and we're unified on this matter. What you did yesterday violated the standards we hold in Willow Creek. You can't be serious, James, Thornton sputtered. Over a spilled cup of coffee and a cafe girl? Over assaulting a woman in public view, the mayor corrected firmly, and threatening our marshal when he upheld the law. The council has voted you'll pay a fine of $50 to the town fund, and you'll make a public apology to Miss Zimmerman. Thornton looked around at the resolute faces of the townspeople, clearly searching for allies and finding none. His ranch hands shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to challenge the united front of the town. This is absurd, Thornton muttered, but the fight was leaving him. He reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a wad of bills and tossed them on the nearest table. There's your blood money. And the apology, Mayor Wilson insisted. Thornton's face twisted in a grimace, but he turned to Lillian. I apologize for my reaction yesterday, Miss Zimmerman. The words were grudging, but they were spoken. Lillian nodded her acceptance, knowing it was as much as could be expected. Now, I suggest you and your men return to your ranch, Frank, the mayor continued. Give folks time to settle. With a final glare at Mason, Thornton gestured to his men, and they filed out of the cafe. The tension broke as the door swung shut behind them, replaced by excited chatter as townspeople discussed what had transpired. Mason was at Lillian's side immediately. I told you to stay at the boarding house, he said, his voice low with concern rather than anger. I couldn't let May face trouble that began with me, Lillian replied simply. Besides, I thought perhaps a woman's presence might help diffuse the situation. That was either very brave or very foolish, Mason said, shaking his head. Probably both. Sometimes the bravest actions appear foolish until they succeed, Lillian countered with a small smile. Mason couldn't help but smile in return. You're unlike any woman I've met, Lillian Zimmerman. I'll take that as a compliment, Marshal Hayes. The incident at May's Cafe marked a turning point for Lillian in Willow Creek. Where before she had been simply the Eastern girl, she was now greeted warmly as she walked through town. Patrons at the cafe left her generous tips, and several of the town's ladies made a point to introduce themselves after Sunday services. For Mason, the confrontation with Thornton had reinforced his commitment to maintaining justice in the town he'd grown to love. But it had also awakened something he'd long kept dormant, an interest beyond duty, a longing for connection that he'd denied himself since arriving in Willow Creek. In the weeks that followed, Mason found reasons to stop by the cafe during Lillian's shifts. Their conversations ranged from books they'd read to their differing experiences, growing up Mason on a small farm in Missouri, Lillian in a comfortable Boston home. Despite their different backgrounds, they discovered shared values, a respect for honesty, a belief in fairness, and a deep appreciation for the beauty of the world around them. Spring was giving way to summer when Mason finally gathered the courage to ask Lillian to accompany him to the town's Independence Day celebration. They stood on the boardwalk outside the cafe as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. I'd be honored, Lillian replied, her smile warming him more than the July evening. Though I should warn you, I know nothing about Western dances. I'm not much of a dancer myself, Mason admitted with a chuckle. But I'd be happy to teach you what little I know. The 4th of July dawned clear and hot, the town decked in bunting and flags for the celebration. Children ran through the streets waving small flags, while men set up tables and a wooden dance platform in the town square. Women carried covered dishes to the community feast, exchanging recipes and gossip. Mason arrived at the boarding house precisely at noon, dressed in his best clothes, clean black trousers, a white shirt, and a vest that had rarely seen use. He'd polished his boots until they gleamed and even trimmed his usually neglected beard. Mrs. Peterson answered his knock with a knowing smile. "My, don't you look fine today, Marshal? Lillian will be down in a moment." When Lillian appeared on the stairs, Mason momentarily forgot how to breathe. She wore a dress of soft green that matched her eyes, her hair arranged with fresh wildflowers instead of her usual simple pins. She had a natural beauty that needed no enhancement, but the effort she'd made for the occasion touched him deeply. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm as she reached the bottom of the stairs. A blush colored her cheeks. "Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself." The celebration was in full swing when they arrived at the town square. Tables groaned under the weight of food-roasted meats, fresh bread, pies of every description. Children played games organized by the schoolteacher, while the town's amateur band tuned their instruments on the platform. As they moved through the crowd, Mason was acutely aware of the glances they received, some curious, others approving. Though he had always been respected in Willow Creek, his position had kept him somewhat apart from the community. To be seen openly courting a woman was a departure from his usual reserved demeanor. "Marshal Hayes," Mayor Wilson called, waving them over to where he stood with his wife and several council members. "And Miss Zimmerman, don't you both look splendid today?" "Thank you, Mayor," Mason replied with a nod. "It's a fine turnout this year." "Indeed it is. The largest we've had since the town was founded," the mayor agreed proudly. "Miss Zimmerman, I hope you're finding Willow Creek to your liking, despite your challenging introduction." "Very much so," Lillian assured him. "The people here have been wonderfully welcoming." Mrs. Wilson, a plump, motherly woman, leaned in conspiratorially. "We're just pleased to see the Marshal taking an interest in something besides keeping the peace. He works too hard, you know." "Martha," the mayor chided gently, though his eyes twinkled with amusement. Mason cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the attention. "If you'll excuse us, I promise to show Lillian the horseshoe tournament." As they made their way across the square, Lillian's hand resting lightly on Mason's arm, she glanced up at him. "They care about you," she observed. "The whole town does." "They're good people," Mason replied, his discomfort fading. "When I came here, the town was struggling. Outlaws regularly raided the businesses, the mine was failing, and folks were considering abandoning the place entirely. We worked together to turn things around." "You give yourself too little credit," Lillian said softly. "From what I've heard, your arrival changed everything." Mason shrugged modestly. "I just did what needed doing." The afternoon passed pleasantly as they enjoyed the festivities. Mason introduced Lillian to dozens of townspeople, many of whom she knew only as cafe patrons. They cheered on the horseshoe competitors, sampled Mrs. Baker's famous apple pie, which won first prize, and watched the children's sack races with matching smiles. As the sun began to set, lanterns were lit around the square, and the band struck up a lively tune. Couples moved onto the wooden platform, forming sets for a country dance. "Would you care to dance?" Mason asked, offering his hand. Lillian hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. "I warned you I don't know the steps." "Just follow my lead," he encouraged, leading her to the edge of the platform. "It's simpler than it looks." The dance was indeed straightforward, involving changing partners in a circle, But Lillian found herself breathless with laughter as she occasionally turned the wrong way or stepped on Mason's toes. His patience never wavered, his large hands steadying her when she lost her balance, his smile encouraging rather than judgmental. When the music changed to a slower waltz, Mason drew her closer. "This one I do know," he said softly, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. "My mother insisted I learn before I left home." "She was wise," Lillian murmured, acutely aware of his nearness, the warmth of his hand through the fabric of her dress. They moved together with surprising grace, finding a rhythm that felt natural despite their limited experience dancing together. Around them, the world seemed to fade, the music, the crowd, even the colorful explosion of fireworks that began overhead, all secondary to the connection they shared in that moment. As the waltz ended, neither moved immediately to break apart. Mason's eyes held a question, one Lillian answered by reaching up to touch his face gently. "Would you walk with me?" he asked, his voice husky with emotion. "Away from the crowd for a bit?" Lillian nodded, and they slipped away from the dance platform, moving toward the quieter edge of town where the wild grasses began. The fireworks continued to burst overhead, illuminating their path in flashes of red, white, and blue. They stopped beneath a large cottonwood tree, its leaves rustling softly in the evening breeze. Mason turned to face Lillian, taking both her hands in his. "I've never been a man of many words," he began, his usual confidence replaced by a touching vulnerability. "But I need you to know that these past months, getting to know you, have been the happiest of my life." Lillian squeezed his hands encouragingly. "They've been wonderful for me too, Mason." "When I first came to Willow Creek, I was running from ghosts," he continued, his gaze steady on hers despite the difficulty of the admission. "I lost my family, my wife and son, to typhoid back in Missouri. I thought burying myself in work, in making a difference in a town that needed help, would be enough." "Oh, Mason," Lillian whispered, her heart aching for his loss. "It was, for a time," he acknowledged. "But then you arrived, with your Eastern manners and your unfailing courage, and suddenly I found myself wanting more again, hoping again." A firework burst directly overhead, bathing them in golden light as Mason reached up to touch her cheek softly. "I know it hasn't been long, and I have no right to ask, but I find myself falling in love with you, Lillian Zimmerman." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "I'm falling in love with you too, Mason Hayes." The kiss that followed was gentle, a promise exchanged beneath the stars and the fading glow of fireworks. When they finally parted, Mason rested his forehead against hers, a smile of wonder on his face. "I never expected to find this again," he admitted, "to find you." "Sometimes life gives us second chances when we least expect them," Lillian replied, thinking of her own journey from loss in Boston to unexpected happiness in this frontier town. They returned to the celebration hand in hand, both aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. The evening continued with more dancing and laughter, but now there was an undercurrent of shared understanding, of possibilities taking shape. As Mason walked Lillian back to the boarding house that night, the town quiet after the festivities, they made plans to ride out to a nearby lake the following Sunday. Their courtship had officially begun, acknowledged now by both. At the boarding house steps, Mason kissed her once more, a promise of tomorrows to come. "Good night, Lillian." "Good night, Mason," she replied, reluctant to end the perfect day. "Thank you for making my first Independence Day in Willow Creek so memorable." "The first of many," he promised, watching until she was safely inside before turning toward his small house near the marshal's office, his steps lighter than they had been in years. The summer days that followed took on a golden quality for Lillian and Mason. When not attending to their respective duties, Mason keeping peace in the growing town, Lillian serving customers at the cafe they spent every possible moment together. Sunday rides into the surrounding countryside became a cherished ritual, with Mason teaching Lillian to ride properly rather than simply perch side saddle as she had been taught in Boston. August found them by the promised lake, a clear mountain pool fed by snowmelt. They had packed a picnic bread, cheese, cold chicken, and the season's first apples, and spread a blanket beneath a stand of aspen trees whose leaves had just begun to hint at the golden transformation to come. "I've been thinking," Mason said as they watched eagles soar overhead, its wingspan impressive against the cloudless sky. "A dangerous pastime," Lillian teased, leaning back on her elbows, more relaxed than she'd ever been in proper Boston society. Mason chuckled. "Perhaps. But I've been thinking about the future. About us." Lillian's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "And what conclusions have you reached, Marshal Hayes?" "That I don't want to imagine my life without you in it," he replied simply, turning to face her fully. "That I want to build something lasting with you, if you'll have me." "Mason, are you—" "Not yet," he interrupted with a smile. "Not officially. When I propose, it won't be a half-formed thought by a lakeside. You deserve better than that." Relief and anticipation mingled in Lillian's chest. "I appreciate the warning," she said, unable to suppress a smile. "Though I should warn you in return, my answer is already decided." Mason's eyes darkened with emotion. "Is that so?" "It is," she confirmed, reaching for his hand. "Whatever you're building, Marshal Hayes, I want to be part of it." He kissed her then, more deeply than before, his arms drawing her close as they sealed this unspoken promise. The future stretched before them, as vast and promising as the western sky. Their idyll was interrupted the following week when a telegram arrived for Mason. Lillian was serving the lunchtime crowd at the cafe when she saw him enter, his expression unusually grave. "What is it?" she asked when she could step away from her tables. "Trouble," he replied grimly. "The Pharaoh gang has been spotted heading this way. 3 brothers wanted in 4 territories for robbery and murder." Lillian's stomach tightened with fear. Though Willow Creek had seen its share of troublemakers since her arrival, none had posed a serious threat to the peace Mason had established. "What will you do?" "I've already sent for my deputy to return from Denver," Mason said. "And I'm organizing a town meeting for tonight to warn folks to be extra vigilant. The Pharaohs typically target banks and stagecoach shipments, but they're unpredictable and violent." That evening, the town hall was packed as Mason outlined the threat and the precautions he wanted everyone to take. The bank would temporarily restrict its hours, valuables would be hidden, and a night watch was established among the town's able-bodied men. "I don't want any heroes," Mason emphasized, his gaze sweeping the room. "If you see these men, report to me or Deputy Collins immediately. Do not engage them yourselves." As the meeting dispersed, Lillian noticed Frank Thornton in earnest conversation with Mason near the door. Though the cattle baron had kept his distance since the cafe incident, relations between the 2 men remained cool at best. "What did Mr. Thornton want?" Lillian asked when Mason joined her outside. "To offer his ranch hands as additional security for the town," Mason replied, surprise evident in his voice. "Seems he's concerned about his weekly bank deposits being at risk." "Or perhaps he's not entirely the villain we thought," Lillian suggested diplomatically. Mason raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps. But I'll still be keeping a close eye on his men if they come into town." The following days passed in a state of tense anticipation. Deputy Collins returned from Denver, a capable young man whom Mason had trained personally. The stagecoach arrived and departed without incident, but Mason's sources indicated the Pharaoh gang was still in the area, possibly scouting the town before making their move. Lillian found herself watching the cafe door whenever it opened, startling at unexpected noises. Though she tried to maintain her usual cheerful demeanor with customers, the strain began to show. "You should stay at my place tonight," Mason suggested one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch after supper. "Or I could ask the Wilsons to take you in. Their house is closer to the center of town, more secure." "I'm not leaving Mrs. Peterson alone," Lillian replied firmly. "She's been kind to me since I arrived, and she's not as young as she pretends to be." Mason sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw. "At least keep this with you," he said, removing a small derringer from his pocket. "It's loaded, and the trigger pulls easy." Lillian accepted the weapon hesitantly. In Boston, she had never so much as touched a gun. "I hope I won't need to use it." "So do I," Mason agreed, covering her hand with his. "But I'll rest easier knowing you have it." 3 days later, the waiting ended. Lillian was just finishing her morning shift at the cafe when the sound of gunshots echoed from the direction of the bank. Customers dove for cover as Mason burst through the door, his expression grim. "Stay inside," he ordered, making eye contact with Lillian briefly before rushing back out, drawing his revolver as he went. More shots followed, along with shouting and the thunder of hooves. Through the windows, Lillian could see people running for cover, merchants hurriedly closing their shops. May appeared beside her, the shotgun once again in her capable hands. "Get in the back room," the older woman instructed. "I'll watch the front." "I can help," Lillian protested, thinking of the derringer in her reticule. May's expression softened slightly. "I know you can, girl, but that man of yours will never forgive me if I let something happen to you. Now go." Reluctantly, Lillian retreated to the kitchen area, where she could still hear the chaos outside, but could no longer see what was happening. The minutes stretched endlessly as sporadic gunfire continued, punctuated by shouted orders that she couldn't quite make out. Then came a sound that made her blood run cold, the front door of the cafe crashing open, followed by May's defiant voice. "You take one more step, mister, and it'll be your last." "Put that scattergun down, old woman," a rough voice replied. "I ain't here for your money. Just need a place to lay low till my brothers circle round." Lillian's hand closed around the derringer in her reticule. Moving quietly to the door that separated the kitchen from the main cafe, she peered through the crack. A man stood just inside the entrance, tall, unshaven, with a wild look in his eyes and blood staining one sleeve of his duster. He had a revolver pointed at May, who stood her ground behind the counter, shotgun unwavering. "There are lawmen all over this street," May warned. "You won't get far." The man one of the Farrow brothers, Lillian presumed, laughed harshly. "I've outrun better marshals than your town boasts. Now put that gun down before I decide I don't like your attitude." Lillian knew she had only moments to act. The derringer held just 2 shots, and she had never fired a gun in her life. But if she did nothing, May would certainly be hurt or killed. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped into the cafe. Derringer held in both hands to steady it. "Drop your weapon," she commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. Farrow whirled toward her, momentarily startled by the new threat. His surprise quickly gave way to amusement. "Well, ain't you a sight?" he drawled. "Pretty little thing playing at being brave. That pea shooter won't do much damage, sweetheart." "Perhaps not," Lillian acknowledged, desperately trying to remember Mason's instructions about the weapon. "But at this distance, I can't miss, and I believe even a small bullet would be quite unpleasant." Farrow's eyes narrowed, reassessing the situation. He now faced threats from 2 directions, and the determination in Lillian's eyes suggested she wasn't bluffing. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if the cafe door hadn't suddenly burst open again. Mason stood framed in the doorway, his revolver trained on Farrow's back. "It's over, Farrow," he said, his voice cold with authority. "Your brothers are in custody. Drop the gun." Farrow tensed, clearly calculating his odds. In that moment of hesitation, May pumped the shotgun meaningfully. "I wouldn't if I were you," she advised. "Between the three of us, you won't make it 2 steps." With a curse, Pharaoh let his revolver clatter to the floor. Mason moved swiftly to kick it away before securing the outlaw's hands behind his back with handcuffs. "You all right?" he asked, his eyes finding Lillian's over Pharaoh's shoulder. She nodded, lowering the derringer with hands that had begun to tremble now that the danger had passed. "We're fine. Are you hurt?" "Nothing serious," Mason assured her, though she noted a tear in his shirt and what appeared to be a graze on his upper arm. "Your deputy?" Lillian asked, concern evident in her voice. "Taking the other two to the jail," Mason replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips despite the situation. Thornton's men actually proved useful. They cut off the gang's escape route. As Mason marched Pharaoh out of the cafe, the outlaw glanced back at Lillian with a mixture of grudging respect and resentment. "Next time you point a gun at someone, girl, make sure you're ready to pull the trigger." "There won't be a next time for you," Mason said firmly, giving the man a none too gentle push forward. In the aftermath of the Pharaoh gang's attempted robbery, Willow Creek buzzed with excitement. The story of how Marshal Hayes and his deputy, with help from Thornton's ranch hands, had captured the notorious outlaws grew with each telling. But it was the tale of Lillian confronting one of the pharaohs with nothing but a derringer and sheer courage that truly captured the town's imagination. "You're quite the hero," Mason teased gently as they sat on the boarding house porch that evening after the excitement had died down. His arm was properly bandaged now, the bullet graze cleaned and dressed by Doc Wilson. "I was terrified," Lillian admitted, leaning against his uninjured side. "But I couldn't let him hurt May." Mason's arm tightened around her shoulders. "That's what courage is doing, what needs to be done despite the fear." His voice grew serious. "But please don't put yourself in danger like that again. When I saw you standing there, facing down Pharaoh." "Now you know how I felt watching you run toward gunfire," Lillian replied softly. "I suppose we'll have to get used to worrying about each other." The implication of a shared future hung between them, comfortable and right. 2 days later, with the Pharaoh brothers safely transported to Denver to stand trial, Mason asked Lillian to accompany him on an evening walk. The late summer air was mild, the streets peaceful once more. He led her to a small rise at the edge of town, where a lone bench overlooked the valley below. "I had this made last week," Mason explained as they sat, gesturing to the new bench. "I thought the town could use a place to appreciate the view." Lillian smiled, suspecting there was more to the story. "It's perfect." As they watched the sunset paint the mountains in hues of pink and gold, Mason took her hand in his. "I told you once that when I proposed, it wouldn't be a half-formed thought," he began, his voice husky with emotion. "That I would do it properly, with the respect you deserve." Lillian's breath caught as he slid from the bench to one knee before her, still holding her hand. "Lillian Zimmerman, you came into my life unexpectedly that day at the cafe. I thought I was simply doing my duty when I said, 'Not while I'm here,' but I was also making a promise I didn't yet understand." He reached into his pocket with his free hand, producing a small ring with a modest diamond that caught the last rays of sunlight. "I'm making that promise again today, with full awareness of its meaning. I love you. I want to build a life with you, to face whatever comes together. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy spilled down Lillian's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, Mason. Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger before rising to sit beside her once more, drawing her into a kiss that sealed their commitment to each other. "I had this bench made so we'd always have a place to remember this moment," Mason confessed when they finally parted. "A place that's ours." "Our bench," Lillian agreed, resting her head on his shoulder as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Though I suspect we'll be building many things together that are ours in the years to come. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Willow Creek, met with universal approval. May insisted on hosting a celebration at the cafe, which turned into an impromptu party as townspeople stopped by throughout the day to offer congratulations and small gifts. Even Frank Thornton made an appearance, surprising everyone by presenting Lillian with a fine set of silver serving spoons and offering Mason a gruff handshake. "No hard feelings about the cafe incident," he said, an awkward attempt at reconciliation. "A man can admit when he's been wrong." "Appreciated," Mason replied simply, willing to let bygones be bygones for the sake of community harmony. As summer gave way to fall, wedding preparations consumed much of Lillian's free time. Mrs. Wilson and several other town ladies took her under their wing, helping with everything from selecting fabric for her dress to planning the ceremony and reception. Mason, meanwhile, set about expanding his small house on the edge of town. With help from friends and neighbors, he added a proper bedroom, enlarged the kitchen, and built a covered porch where Lillian could sit in the evenings. "It's not what you were used to in Boston," he said apologetically, as he showed her the progress one crisp October afternoon. "But I hope it will be comfortable." Lillian touched his face gently. "It will be our home, Mason. That makes it more precious than any mansion in Boston." The wedding was set for the first Saturday in November, before winter's full arrival, but after the harvest was complete. The whole town turned out for the occasion, the church decorated with autumn leaves and late-blooming wildflowers gathered by the school children. Lillian wore a gown of ivory satin that Mrs. Wilson and May had helped her sew, with lace sent by her one remaining aunt in Boston. Her hair was adorned with a crown of small white flowers, and she carried a bouquet of late roses and evergreen sprigs. As she walked down the aisle on Mayor Wilson's arm, the closest thing to a father figure she had in Willow Creek, Lillian's eyes never left Mason's. He stood tall and proud at the altar, wearing a new black suit, his badge polished for the occasion. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, their vows spoken clearly for all to hear. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from the congregation nearly lifted the church roof. The celebration that followed at the town hall lasted well into the evening, with dancing, feasting, and more than a few emotional toasts. As night fell, the newlyweds slipped away to their waiting wagon, ready to begin their life together in the home Mason had prepared. "Mrs. Hayes," Mason said softly as he helped her into the wagon, still marveling at the reality of their union. "That will take some getting used to," Lillian replied with a smile, accepting his hand. "But I believe I'll enjoy the adjustment." The house was aglow with lamplight when they arrived, a welcoming beacon in the gathering darkness. Mason surprised Lillian by lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold, a tradition she had mentioned once in passing. Inside, everything was ready for their new beginning, a fire laid in the hearth, fresh linens on the bed, a small table set for breakfast the following morning. It was modest by Eastern standards, but to Lillian, it was perfect. "Welcome home," Mason said, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. "Home," Lillian repeated, the word filled with promise. "Our home." The years that followed brought both joy and challenges to the Hayes household. Mason continued as Marshal of Willow Creek, his reputation for fair but firm justice drawing settlers to the growing town. Lillian eventually left her position at the cafe to open a small bookshop, fulfilling a dream she had mentioned to Mason during their courtship. "Willow Creek needs more than just necessities," she had explained as they prepared the storefront. "People hunger for stories, for knowledge, for connection to the wider world." The bookshop quickly became a community gathering place, with Lillian hosting reading circles for children and adults alike. Mason built shelves that lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each one filled with carefully selected volumes that Lillian ordered from Denver and even as far away as New York. Their greatest joy arrived in the summer of 1880, a daughter they named Elizabeth May Hayes, honoring both Lillian's mother and the woman who had become like family to them both. May, now in her 60s, doted on the child as if she were her own grandchild. Little Elizabeth, or Ellie, as she was affectionately known, had her father's steady nature and her mother's curious mind. She toddled among the bookshelves as soon as she could walk, selecting picture books that Mason would read to her in the evenings by the fire. In 1883, their family expanded again with the arrival of Samuel Wilson Hayes, named for Mason's father and the mayor who had become one of their dearest friends. Sam was a sturdy boy with a boisterous laugh who worshipped his father and followed him everywhere when he wasn't on duty. Life wasn't without its hardships. The winter of 1884 brought a devastating blizzard that isolated Willow Creek for nearly 3 weeks, testing the community's resources and resilience. Lillian organized a soup kitchen in the town hall, while Mason coordinated efforts to reach outlying homesteads where families might be stranded. During that difficult time, they lost May to pneumonia, a blow that left Lillian grieving deeply for the woman who had been her first friend in the West. In her memory, Lillian established a small lending library within the bookshop, ensuring that books would be available to everyone in town regardless of their ability to pay. Through it all, the bond between Mason and Lillian only strengthened. Each evening, no matter how busy their days had been, they made time to sit together on the porch or by the fire, sharing the events of the day and simply enjoying each other's company. Often, they would walk to their bench on the hill overlooking the town, watching as Willow Creek grew and prospered. What had once been a struggling frontier outpost was now a thriving community with a school, a proper doctor's office, and even talk of a railroad spur connecting them to Denver. "Did you ever imagine this?" Lillian asked one evening in the spring of 1888, as they sat on the bench that had weathered a decade of seasons. Below them, the town glowed with lamplight, and the distant sound of a piano from the new hotel drifted on the breeze. "When you first came here, did you see what it could become?" Mason considered the question, his arm around her shoulders as it had been countless times before. At 43, his hair showed more silver now, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but his gaze was as steady as ever. "I saw potential," he admitted, "but I don't think I truly understood what was possible until you arrived. You helped me see beyond simply maintaining order to building something lasting." Lillian leaned into his embrace, as comfortable there as she had been on their wedding day. "It's remarkable how one moment can change everything," she mused. "If I hadn't spilled that coffee? If Thornton hadn't reacted as he did," Mason continued. "If you hadn't been passing by at that exact moment," Lillian added. Mason turned to face her more fully, taking her hands in his. Though they had been married for nearly a decade, the love in his eyes remained as bright as ever. "I've never believed much in fate," he said thoughtfully. "I've always thought a man makes his own way in this world through his choices and actions. But sometimes, when I look at our life together, at our children, at this town we've helped build." He gestured toward the valley below. "I can't help but wonder if some things are meant to be." Lillian smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. "Perhaps it's both," she suggested. "Perhaps fate puts opportunities in our path, but it's still up to us to recognize them and act. Like a man choosing to step through a cafe door when he hears trouble," Mason said, a smile tugging at his lips. "Or a woman deciding to leave behind everything she knows to seek a new beginning," Lillian countered. As twilight deepened into night, they remained on their bench, hands clasped, watching over the town that had become the setting for their unexpected love story. They had both come to Willow Creek seeking something different. Mason a purpose to fill the void left by tragedy. Lillian an opportunity to define herself beyond the constraints of her upbringing. Neither had been looking for love, yet they had found it in the most unlikely of circumstances: a moment of conflict, a spilled cup of coffee, and 5 words that had changed everything. Not while I'm here. From that simple declaration of principle had grown a partnership, a family, and a legacy that would shape Willow Creek for generations to come. It wasn't the life either of them had envisioned, but as they made their way home to their children that night, walking hand in hand beneath the vast western sky, both Mason and Lillian Hayes knew it was precisely the life they were meant to live together.